After U.S. Iran talks in Islamabad over the weekend failed to achieve any breakthroughs, President Trump announced a blockade of Iranian shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran itself has blockaded the strait since the U.S. and Israel launched attacks in late February, triggering what the International Energy Agency has called the largest disruption in the history of global oil markets. Iran has threatened to respond to this newest U.S. blockade by shutting down Red Sea access. The Red Sea has become a vital alternative route amidst the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Adam Gallagher, a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities, and today I'm going to be speaking with Rose Kelanic. Rose directs Defense Priorities Middle East program, and she has a new journal article out in the Washington Quarterly where she breaks down myths and misconceptions about U.S. energy security strategies and how to fix the weaknesses in those strategies. She also has a piece out in the New York Times where she talks about these issues within the context of the Iran war. Here are three things you need to know. Hey, Rose, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Adam. Happy to be here.
Yeah. I want to start off and talk a little bit about what this war in Iran has revealed about weaknesses in U.S. energy security strategies, and also some of the misconceptions that we've seen about how global oil markets work, as politicians and pundits have talked about the ramifications of the war and the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz. So, can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'm going to start with like the misconceptions because
Yeah.
we have to correct those to understand why the solutions we've pursued haven't worked so well, right?
Right.
The biggest misconception that people don't understand is that oil is bought and sold in a global market, and one way that economists sometimes talk about this is to model it as a bathtub, right? So imagine a giant bathtub. It has many spigots. That's all the countries that are putting oil into the bathtub, and many drains. That's all the countries that are consuming oil from the bathtub, right? And most countries that are spigots are also drains. So the US puts in oil to the global bathtub, we also consume it, okay? It doesn't matter which molecules from which spigot comes out of which drain. What
Right.
matters is how much oil is available in the bathtub and then whether that level is going up or down. So if the total
Hmm.
amount of oil available decreases, that means the price goes up for everybody drawing oil from the bathtub. And it does not matter if you produce more oil than you consume domestically, which is the case for the US, right? We're a net
Right.
petroleum exporter. We are still connected to the bathtub, and American consumers are going to pay the bathtub market price for oil no matter what, right?
Hmm.
So for that reason, the US is just really vulnerable to spikes in global oil prices. And unfortunately, the US has not followed good strategies for dealing with this. There are two strategies that are especially mistaken. One is the drill baby drill strategy. And
Hmm. Yeah.
whatever the benefits of increased US oil production are, and there are some, it's not going to take us out of the bathtub. So it's not going to insulate us from these kind of supply shocks.
Right.
The other big mistaken strategy that we've done is to have this military power strategy where we have large contingents of US troops positioned in the Middle East constantly. And the idea behind that was that it was supposed to deter anybody from trying to interfere with free access to Persian Gulf oil. And that's a
Yeah.
commitment that the US made during the Cold War when it was worried about the Soviet Union potentially interfering with access to supply and how that would hurt the free world, et cetera, et
Hmm.
cetera. That strategy is mistaken in sort of two ways. One way is it doesn't protect the U.S. from supply shocks that come from anywhere else. So when Russia invaded Ukraine and oil prices spiked, having a bunch of troops in the Middle East did not help.
Right.
Um, we're also discovering that even in the situation we thought that it would be useful to have troops there for, it also is not helping, right? The US military presence actually is what convinced Iran, right, to attack all these bases in the region and to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
And even though we have bases in the region, it doesn't make it any easier to reopen that strait because whatever ships go through it are going to be subjected to attack from Iranian drones, mines, cruise missiles, et cetera, et cetera. And having a big forward military presence still doesn't help us very much with that. So, this is the underpinning rationale for the U.S. presence in the region, and it turns out it's not really helping us and has potentially hurt us in this scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that big forward operating presence has basically proved to have no utility, not just in terms of, the energy security issues we're talking about, but in the service of the conflict itself. I mean, 13 of those bases have been heavily damaged and are basically inhospitable. And there was a New York Times report on how they're now most of the servicemen who were working in those bases are working remotely now, which I found pretty interesting. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mentioned in the intro some of your recent work, including your Washington Quarterly paper. In that paper, you contend that oil intensity is the U.S.'s real energy security vulnerability. Can you talk about what that means, and also how in this current crisis, it appears that the U.S. is being hit harder than China and Russia because of that oil intensity?
Yeah, so this is another key point, and it's another way that people have, not fully understood how oil markets work or how oil affects the economy. So even though the U.S. produces a lot of oil, we also consume way more oil than peer countries. We consume more oil per capita, but we also consume more oil for every unit of gross domestic product. So that's every unit of economic output that we produce. So the US consumes twice as much oil per unit of GDP as EU countries. It consumes about 40% more oil than China for each unit of GDP. And it even consumes 20% more oil than Russia, which is kind of amazing because Russia is a petro state, right? So, you know, if you think about just economically, if you're a country or a company and you rely 40% more heavily on a particular input for your production, if the price of that input goes up, you're going to be hurt more than the other companies that are, manufacturing products, right? So, the US, because we're so oil intensive, is hurt a lot more. And the intensivity of the US economy, or the oil intensity of the US economy, really goes back to like our car loving culture, and how so many Americans, many American households own two cars. We rely on automobile transit. That makes us oil intensive. And then we've also been pretty slow compared to the rest of the world to adopt EVs. And EVs are significant because they don't run on oil, right? They run on electricity that's not generated by oil. And so if the US switched to EVs, like China has been doing, like the EU has been doing at higher rates than we have, that would reduce our oil intensity.
Yeah. 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 Well, I'm sitting in the car capital of America in Detroit, so that issue is particularly conspicuous for me living here. I wonder if I could just
Yeah.
ask you, how does U.S. oil intensity today compare to how it did like in the 70s during the oil embargo then?
Yeah, so there's some good news here, which is that everybody in the world, including the US, is less oil intensive in economic production than during the 1970s oil shocks. So compared to 1973, when the big OAPEC, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, had
Yeah.
a blockade or an embargo on the United States, we have like the world as a whole is half as reliant on oil. So we're 50% less, we consume 50% less oil for each unit of global GDP. And the US is doing a little bit better than average there. So we consume or we rely 60% less on oil today than we did 50 years ago, or a little more than 50 years ago for that during that supply shock. So overall, that suggests that the shock, if it were a shock of the same size and duration, would hurt
Uh-huh.
us less.
Right.
But we also don't know, how long is this going to go on? How big a shock will end up being? That's not clear.
Right. One last follow-up question on this. I'm wondering why you think there was so much focus on and thought that this blockade of the Strait by the Iranians would hurt China so much because it gets what half of its oil from the Middle East, from the Gulf region in specific. Is it just a lack of understanding of how much China has de-risked from oil or about its reserves? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a very broad misunderstanding. So
Okay.
it's a misunderstanding of the bathtub. So even if China didn't get any oil from the Persian Gulf, if oil is cut off coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, that's decreasing the amount of oil going in the bathtub, and that's going to increase the price for everybody, including China. So it doesn't really
Right.
matter how much they get from the Middle East. Where it does show up is that the supply disruptions tend to hit Asia first because there's like longer time that oil spends in transit from the Middle East to China just for geographic reasons.
Okay.
So some of these, like shortages that we're seeing show up throughout the economy are showing up in those places first, in Asia, some in Africa, some in Europe. And they're not showing up in the US yet because tankers are still on the water on their way to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere. Now, over time, arbitrage of oil is going to change that up. And you're going to see less disruptions, physical disruptions, and more, just a sort of across the board price increase for everybody. But yeah, I mean, China, they've historically gotten a lot of Persian Gulf oil. They get a lot of oil from Iran. But of course, Iran, until the US has now counter blockaded, right?
Yeah.
Iran was able to send its oil to China. So that particular oil export was not interrupted. Now, what that meant was that was more oil going into the bathtub for everyone. So by the US closing off that sort of release valve of Iranian oil, we're just lowering the level in the bathtub for all of us, ourselves included, right?
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
So zooming out, what's the big lesson from the war in Iran, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, that policymakers should glean to better secure U.S. energy strategies?
So clearly, the answer is the United States needs to invest in de-risking from petroleum. And the easiest way to do that is with electric vehicles, with EVs. And, it's unfortunate from a strategic standpoint that EVs have become so polarized. So they're kind of, associated with left-wing causes, with
Right.
climactic concerns and all of this, and with green energy. And, the fact of the matter is, like, EVs and fossil fuels can work together. So, if you plug an EV into an electric grid that is more than 99% independent of oil, which is what the US electric grid is, right? We don't
Mhm.
burn oil to produce electricity, right? Then you have taken transportation away from this big source of supply shocks and price shocks. And that EV can run on a grid powered by coal, right? And
Yeah.
it's actually still better for the environment. Like, if you plug your EV into a coal powered grid, you are still putting less carbon in the atmosphere than if you were driving an oil fueled car. So it's literally an everyone wins situation,
Yeah.
whether you care about climate or whatnot. But just from a strategic perspective, it can help de-risk us from oil, and that's clearly something the United States needs to do. And if we think about this war in Iran, it's not clear why the US started this war, but to the extent that we care about Iran because it's an oil producing country or it's located in the Middle East, right? If oil has a factor here, or other wars that we fought in the Middle East that might have had some relationship to oil, like, what if we took those billions of dollars or trillions of dollars, instead of fighting these wars, we invested in electrification of the fleet, and
Yeah.
then the Middle East just doesn't matter anymore, right? It just
Right.
doesn't matter. Like, we
Yeah.
can break our dependence on the Middle East if we break our dependence on oil. So that's clearly what we need to do. And some of that will happen naturally because of the price shock. That's going to make EVs more attractive to consumers, just no matter what happens. But there's also potentially a role for the government to play in encouraging EV adoption, and it should consider doing that going forward.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Rose, for that analysis. It's nice amid all of the, like I mentioned at the beginning, the misconceptions you're hearing from politicians and pundits to hear from a real deal oil and energy politics expert on these issues. I want to encourage everybody to check out your Washington Quarterly piece and your New York Times op-ed, which talks about a lot of these issues more within the context of the war, and to follow all your other work on defensepriorities.org.
Thanks so much, Adam.